I worked with Ogilvy, uh, ad agency, and we looked at how well advertising in one country, whether or not an effective campaign in one country is likely to work well in a different country. And I think we were quite surprised by actually how difficult it is for that to happen. In fact, the headline statistic is that only 1 in 3 of ads that were defined as being great performance in one country also achieve great performance in another. There was a relationship. In other words, if you're better in one, more likely to be better in another. But there was absolutely no guarantee that a great ad in one country would be an effective ad in another country. And what I've tried to do here is to kind of summarize some of the correlations, because there were some differences between pairs of countries. So, for example, um, in fact, the highest correlation of all was between France and Spain. Interesting, specifically, it's not France and Spain. So within Western Europe, the correlations were high, but particularly between France and Spain, but also between Germany, UK, France, Italy, Spain. They were all fairly high. That's number one. And then there was also a reasonable correlation between those countries and the US. And as I guess you might guess, given what I'm about to talk about, the correlation between US and Canada was also quite high. But there were some other anomalies that you would not necessarily expect just from geographic and historical connections. So, for example, although Brazil and Mexico had a high correlation, the correlation between Mexico and Argentina was really low. So you can't just talk about middle or it's South America, for example, as a continent, because there's no guarantee that if you air something in Brazil, it'll work in Argentina or vice versa. And even between, I remember the most extreme one, which surprised me a lot, was between Hungary and Poland. So both in Eastern Europe, neighbouring countries, the correlation was extremely low.
Okay.
So, trouble is, I've just realised that on this diagram I've given you the answer. I was going to ask the audience which country would they guess had almost zero correlation with any other country. But I won't. Let's not do it as a poll, Christian, because I've got a cross on the diagram. Yeah,
Japan.
yes,
Yes.
yeah. There's no correlation between ad performance in Japan and any other country in the database at the time. So, very particular style was required there. But I think it's important because it means that just because you've got a creative and you've measured, it might work well in some markets and contexts, but it might completely fail in others. And therefore, it gets back to the idea of systematic measurement becomes really, really important, I think.
Yeah, I also think this like puts the brands a little bit higher. Need for not just translating ads. I think a lot of companies are like translating one to one what is going on in their marketing. They
Right.
have a localization bureau or something like that, but they don't really have the
It's way beyond that because whether or not an ad will perform, translating it is just a small, that's just a hygiene factor. But it still doesn't mean the advertising is going to work at all. What we did do actually. We went on and we looked at kind of what are the reasons, that advertising in one country might not work in another. And there are quite a few, and this summarizes some of those. I'll just take you.
Give me 2 seconds, Dan, before you go into the slide. You can just keep it there. We just have a question that I wanted to bring up before we go there. And actually, I want to ask the audience here because I have a little funny question for you, and please play along here. So let me just run the poll before I answer this question. So.
Oh yeah. Okay.
So if you look at this, what does that mean to you? This picture. I'm just going to start the poll here on the side, and please answer correctly as you can at least.
Yeah, like what is it? Yeah.
What is it in your opinion? Yeah, exactly. This is interesting.
It's a stick.
Oh, look at the poll here.
Oh, that's perfect. Yes. Oh, you got gold as well. Interesting.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about the next slide.
Okay,
then I think that's a really very good way.
Yeah, okay, I might have to jump straight to that one. Oh, yeah. I'll jump straight to that one, just to follow on from the poll that we just did. in that analysis that we did, this huge project, there were effectively 7 reasons why advertising that worked well in one country might not work in another. And one of them, and this is my picture of the stick there at the bottom, is that if an advertising uses a cultural reference that only applies in some countries and not others, and according to our poll, it's 50-50 in terms of the countries of the people on our poll, that is actually a divining or a dowsing rod or a divining rod. And in some cultures, it is believed, it's not true by the way, but it's believed that if you hold a stick like that or 2 separate sticks and they cross, when you walk over water, or apparently gold, I didn't know that, you walk over water, it'll kind of twitch. It'll twitch like that, okay? Which means you can find water, which is obviously valuable. So when I worked for Unilever years ago on the Lipton brand globally, I think it was Thailand, came up with this ad, and it was brilliant, and it had a divining rod, and it was about Lipton iced tea, and the idea was this person was thirsty, and they used a divining rod, and the divining rod pulled them dramatically and engagingly towards away from the desert to this bar that had a Lipton iced tea. You get the idea, you know, refreshment, water, fantastic. But the trouble was, we then tested that ad in multiple other countries, and it only worked in some. And we found out, in retrospect, that it was because the concept, the whole tradition, myth of a divining rod isn't global. It's only in certain countries. And you've got to be careful for that if you're going to use that kind of reference, for example. Now, I've got 6 others to go through. Krista, I'll go through quite quickly because actually we're getting some good questions. But just to go through the other reasons why advertising might not work internationally. I mean, the first one is the category might be just very, very different. So, for example, butter. Butter is used in the UK, particularly for spreading on things. Toast, muffins, English muffins, scones, anything bready, all the time, right? But if you're talking about how butter is used in Mediterranean countries, it's completely different, because in those countries, they typically use olive oil for most uses that butter would be used for, and use butter only for certain things. So obviously, you know, an advert that features the brand being used in that way in the UK is never going to transfer. The next one is about the brand needs different messages to unlock growth. I might just flick to, I think my favourite example of this actually is Pampers. Pampers in most Western markets did a phenomenal job by focusing on dryness, how it keeps your baby dry and comfortable. But it tried several times to launch in China, and it just didn't make inroads until there was an insight based on research that a much more motivating message is in China is the idea of helping sleep. So they came up with this Golden Sleep campaign, and it was phenomenally successful and helped launch the brand in China. So it shows that, you know, the message can be very different. So something that works somewhere may not work at all in others. The third one is brand status and credibility. This really relates to how long a brand has been established and whether it's already known about and loved, versus whether or not in another country the brand is maybe new and unknown or not very well known. There have been cases of trying to launch brands in new countries based on the latest advertising from the country of origin. And they often fail. They often fail because they assume too much credibility and knowledge. And actually, when you launch a brand, you kind of have to prove yourself. You know, you have to explain what you do, for example, what you are, and why you exist. So there's a lot. Launch advertising is very different from kind of ongoing brand advertising. Quickly, just moving on from that. Sometimes advertising relies on advertising properties that have already been established. So this example was came from Impulse, which is a body fragrance for women. And in the UK for 20 years, they'd advertised that the woman would use Impulse, and then the man a man would pass the woman on the street and smell her fragrance and suddenly act upon impulse. You see the branding there, it's quite clever. Or would buy her some flowers and take it up to her, even though he'd never met her before. Which is all very lovely and romantic and old-fashioned and probably sexist, but that, that advertising, only worked after, after that whole idea had been established, originally in a much more straightforward way, in a very obvious way. So later ads in the series didn't work in other countries at all. You also have to start again, go back to where you started for that successful campaign in your first country. Just quickly, a couple more things. One is obvious one. For example, if you're trying to resonate with a particular, I don't know, family in Birmingham, if you show a kitchen in a typical kitchen from Japan, they're not going to identify with it. So sometimes people just don't connect because they don't see themselves in what you're showing them. So obviously the advertising doesn't transfer. I know I've gone a bit too quickly here, Christian, but finally, you've got to be careful about certain very specific things that could cause offence. So I did the fist. Yeah. I shouldn't do it really. I shouldn't. But I mean, I've got a summary here, which is things to avoid, and they usually actually relate to the body, interestingly enough. So do not put any hand signals in your ad that may or may not be interpreted in the same way in other countries. Sometimes they're opposites. For example, don't show the soles of the feet. You probably will have heard of some of these important things, but they're important. They're really important for some cultures. So be careful about how the body is portrayed and used, is what I'd say. There are other cultural faux pas that you can unfortunately fall into, but that's the main one.